Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Europe Responds, which is the new EU-ISS series that is looking at current events and sketching out the implications of them for the European Union. I'm Giuseppe Spatafora. This is the second episode of the series. It's called Syria, Gaza, and the Shifting US-Middle East Strategy. You will have hopefully seen in the first episode, Can Europe Defend Itself? Today, we shift to this very important region, and I'm here with my colleague, Katarzyna Sidło, who is our senior policy analyst for the Middle East and North Africa at the UASS. And she's the expert on the region, of course, but we'll keep it conversational. And we'll try to cover three main topics: issues of Syria, issue of Gaza, and the general US policy towards the region. Of course, trying to sketch how this matters for the EU. It's a lot of topics. It's an important conversation, but we'll try to do our best. Welcome, Kasia, and we'll just get started. We'll start talking with Syria. Obviously, for you as an analyst of the Middle East, the change of government in Syria, the collapse of the Assad regime, is one of those tectonic shifts. It is important for the EU as well, given the relevance that Syria has had for the EU's neighborhood. So why don't you give us your first assessment of how the new government that now is in place in Syria, I understand since last March, led by Ahmed al-Sharaa, how is it going, and how strong it is, and what challenges is it facing?
Right. Well, first of all, good afternoon, Giuseppe, and thank you for having me on the second episode of the podcast. Very happy to be here. So on Syria, well, obviously the government is facing multiple challenges, as you would expect, running a country that's been in 14 years of a civil war. We're thinking here about power consolidation, restoring security, improving the socioeconomic situation of the population, rebuilding infrastructure, so on and so forth. So, like, imagine we're now on the second transitional government, which was sworn in on the 29th of March. Well, so far, it's easy to be very harsh for judging the progress, given the circumstances. I think we're still in this mindset of giving the benefit of the doubt. And given all the challenges, I would say that, the government is making slow but certain progress in implementation of the reforms it set itself out to implement.
Of course, because from what I understand, the HTS, that is one of the most important parties in this government, was first ruling a region, Idlib, right? And then after that, it now controls the entirety of Syria, or a vast majority of it. And of course, a very complex country, ethnically very diverse and so on. Do you think it is, in what kind of challenges it is now facing in terms also of sectarial divides and maybe different economic conditions that it has to face?
Right. No, you're absolutely right. It's a completely different thing to run a province than to run a country, which is still very much divided, and not entire territory is still under the control of the government. When you just think about the economy, different estimations, but the economy contracted throughout the period of the war between 50 and 84%. That's a lot. 9 in 10 Syrians are living below the poverty line. Most people get 1-2 hours electricity of the day. The agricultural sector was all but destroyed. Irrigation systems, lack of fertilizers, lack of seeds. So those are really monumental challenges that we're talking about here. And then, of course, the sectarian divisions that you mentioned. Syria is very ethnically and religiously diverse. And it's not going to be easy to bring back different communities under the governmental umbrella and rebuild the trust. That's going to be one of the key challenges for the new government.
Indeed. And of course, there's one episode that already happened. There was a wave of violence against the minority Alawites in the west of the country. Of course, there was the ethnic group that Assad came from.
Yes, it was more than one. Actually, this is the one that we've heard about most prominently in the media, where there were reports of sectarian violence, even in Damascus suburbs. There are reports of the Alawite minority feeling threatened and under a lot of pressure, some of them thinking about migrating out of Syria. It's a very difficult situation. Like you mentioned, the Alawites is a sect, religious sect from which the Assad family hail from. But we have to remember that not all the Alawites supported Assad. What the violence episodes that we've heard about, the reason why I've heard about is that were huge, and there was a lot of international backlash against it, and there were, of course, mentions of international actor being involved in one way or another as well, most prominently with the Russian Russian military base, former military base, being used as a shelter for certain parts of the population.
Exactly. Well, speaking of Russia and generally the external presence in Syria, this is a leitmotif, right? It's always been there. It's always been a key element. But of course, it is significant, and we need to discuss the fact that it has shifted. For instance, a country such as Turkey, which used to be against the Assad government, now has a major ally there. Russia is in the opposite position. It has lost its main allies. It still hasn't lost its bases, if I understand correctly. But now there's a discussion of whether they are allowed to keep them. And of course, this is an important strategic element that affects Europe as well, given that Russia uses these bases also for other purposes. So what is the situation right now?
Well, it's, as everything, complicated. So, like you mentioned, Russians, they kind of lost the access to their main military bases, in particular the port of Tartus, but also the airbase Meymin near Latakia. So we know for sure that they've been evacuating their equipment for months now, and they officially lost the agreement that they had previously with the Assad regime to, albeit manage the port of Tartus. But they're not completely gone from Syria yet. So during the last episode of violence, we saw Russian military vehicles in Syria near the base, and we know the military was present there because they were offered shelter to groups of Alawites who went there. And we do know that Russia and the new Syrian authorities are in contact. I mean, the al-Sharaa government has been very pragmatic regarding this. Russia is still printing the currency for Syria, and the conversation is ongoing. The Russians are doing what they can to try not to completely lose access to the military bases. They're crucial for them, like you mentioned, not just because they've been present in Syria for many years, but also because Syria, as many other outposts in the Middle East and North Africa, has been serving as a gateway to Africa itself. And that's part of Russian strategy to also help to finance its war in Ukraine.
Yeah, and on that, I would like to just highlight that Kasia wrote an excellent commentary, which you can read on our website on this very topic. And I also wanted to ask you about the role of Europe and of the European Union in all this context. And I guess this needs to tie back to the sanctions. And I guess this also will lead us to the transatlantic discussion as well.
Right. Well, the EU is quite quick to step in. I would say first to ease, well, not remove completely all the sanctions, but to ease certain sanctions. Of course, there are conditions applied, and the EU is observing very closely the situation in Syria. During the Foreign Policy Council yesterday, there was discussion about the next steps, perhaps further removal of sanctions to ease the situation in the country. The sanctions are a major block for reconstruction and a major issue when it comes to the recovery of the Syrian economy. That said, it is still the US sanctions that are the main issue in here, and which are preventing many international actors trying to support Syrian economic recovery. The EU is doing its part. It has a significant diplomatic presence right now. Both on the EU level, individual member states are talking to al-Sharaa government, and like I said, there are conversations ongoing regarding further easing of the sanctions, but without US actually taking the step of easing at least some of the additional sanctions, the economic situation of Syria is most likely not going to improve much very soon.
No, you're making a very interesting parallel there, because of course in Europe and in Eastern Europe we're facing the opposite problem, in which the US may be tempted to lift sanctions on Russia, whereas Europe wants to keep them. And that's here we're talking about a different situation, but the opposite scenario to some extent. And it's important to see this parallel and the differences. Now, you mentioned at the Foreign Affairs Council yesterday, Syria was a topic. Another key topic, of course, was the issue of the war in Gaza, which is back to full-scale violence now. The ceasefire that was brokered back in January has collapsed. The talks for the second phase have not really started or even not taken off. And now it seems like it will return back to the full scale of violence. And the question that I have is, why do you think we're back to this situation?
Well, the official narrative from the Israeli side is that because of the resumption of the fighting was because of Hamas' refusal to release all the hostages, but also less officially fears that during the tours Hamas has been regrouping. And that was posing the danger to Israel, of course. So that's kind of the official narrative. It's really kind of difficult to make any predictions of whether or not the talks will resume right now. The second phase, which was supposed to start, well, hasn't started, quite obviously. And right now we're in a situation where we don't even know whether the ongoing conversations are going to lead into any big breakthrough, given that Hamas is reluctant to completely give up on all its arms. It's open to handing over all their hostages, which is one of the goals that Israel is looking forward to. But at the same time, the goal of Israel is kind of complete, destroying completely the military capacities of Hamas. And that's, of course, Hamas is unwilling to see.
Of course. Yeah, I can imagine how difficult it is to bring these two back to the table. But also the other question I have is what I know you just said it's hard to make predictions, but are there any military objectives that could be seen that we can foresee? For instance, I'll give you an example. Rafah in the first during the first phase of the war that lasted until January was attacked but was never fully occupied. Now it seems like Israel is moving in that direction. Is that a possibility? And now it's no longer off limits?
Yes, well, there's been some talk that right now the Israel and the Israeli military are even talking about possibly taking on themselves distribution of the humanitarian aid to the Palestinians, which previously they were withholding this idea because that would to a certain extent amount to taking responsibility for Gaza and occupation of Gaza, which was not a stated goal before. So I think right now all options are really on the table. Some members of the Knesset and some parts of the Israeli government are quite open regarding their goals of, basically taking over huge parts of Gaza and resumption of the Israeli settlements in there. Some parts, especially in the opposition, are not in line with this, and it appears that most of the public is not really supporting this step. But I think it will, much like with Syria, boil down to the amount of pressure that the US can exert on the Israeli government in terms of, first of all, being back to the table, being more open regarding the conversation. Of course, Hamas needs to express openness as well. But in order to kind of create a situation where we have a clear goal of what needs to happen next, and we need to know what we're even negotiating for.
Exactly. And of course, this brings back to the role of the United States. You mentioned it right now. The US was important in the implementation of the first ceasefire. Now, then that was one of the first Trump-Reagan-like moment in which he came, and immediately there was some sort of end of the conflict. Now the question is whether the US is invested in bringing a second ceasefire, given that it's clearly, at least compared to the previous administration, it's even more openly supportive of Israel. So the question there is whether we will want to bring in that influence.
I mean, yes, in many ways, the US is very supportive of Israel, and this has been a stable policy of all the US governments, whether you think about the Democratic or Republican ones. I don't think the relationship between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu is very good, as you can see from the various. You can't even, I think, describe it as frenemies. There's a lot of misunderstandings, I think, when it comes to the goals of both politicians that they want to achieve. What President Trump wanted to get was a ceasefire deal before they took the office, and he got it. I think right now the issues with the attention also being directed into so many different places, and his special envoy Witkoff basically stretched in between working on the Gaza ceasefire, then working on the Russian-Ukraine deal, and then now also talking about being involved in the negotiations between Iran and the US. So there's perhaps lack of capacity really for him to focus on any of those three conflicts. And like I said, the lack of focus really just on the situation in Gaza from the US side.
Exactly, and this also then this brings me to question whether there were plans for a permanent settlement as opposed to an end to the fighting. But that's we can leave that for the last step. Then I wanted to ask you about the other actors involved, specifically all the countries around Israel, the Arab countries that met in early March for a Palestine summit, and then there's also an Arab plan for reconstruction in Gaza on the table. What do you think are the steps towards even, can we talk about implementing this, or the situation is just far remote from this?
Right. So there are two different elements to your question. I will start with the Arab plan for Gaza, and then I will move to the external actors, local actors, because there we have to talk about going beyond the Arab plan, of course. Well, the Arab plan, or the so-called Arab plan for Gaza, was kind of devised as a direct response to this, I'm not even sure we can call it a plan, but the Middle East Riviera in the Gaza kind of vision. Whether it was serious or not, it's still under the debate. But what it did is it did push the Arab leaders under the leadership of the Egyptians to kind of gather together and work together a plan. So that plan has been rejected so far by the US and Israel, among others, because it, unlike the Riviera plan, it does not assume repopulation of Gaza, or forceful or not forceful but voluntary migration of Palestinians from Gaza. So the Arab plan is focused more on kind of step-by-step rebuilding of the country. What it assumes is that within the first 6 months, you would see kind of technocratic governance, and then as a follow-up, Palestinian Authority taking over responsibility. This is the plan that the EU has welcomed and supported, even though there are some issues that would still have to be worked out, including the funding, who would pay for the reconstruction of Gaza, the question of security, the question of governments, and of course the question of whether or not there's any place for Hamas and in the future of Gaza. On your second question, just very briefly regarding who else is interested in what's going on. So apart from Egyptian and the Gulf partners, of course, and the EU and the US and Israel, I guess you can say that this is where the entire Middle East and North Africa and also Turkey are keeping quite a close eye on. In general, it can be very clearly connected to the situation in Syria and Lebanon as well. Like all three places in Mashraq region have pretty much the same actors that are trying to figure out how to reconfigure and stabilize this particular sub-region.
Indeed, and well, you mentioned. Let's have a couple of words maybe about what the EU has promised to do. Of course, the HRVP had a visit to the region, and yesterday was part again. There are discussion of including the EU Borders Assistance Mission as well as part of this plan. What can the EU realistically do, given its weight, but also what we know, the other political difficulties?
Well, the EU just yesterday promised it will financially continue to support the Palestinian Authority. The EU agreed on 1.6 billion of euros to support Palestinian Authority over the next 3 years. It's been supporting, like I said, the Arab plan and working with like-minded parties on the two-state solution. And that's what they can continue on doing. But there are limits to that. Of course, the two-state solution is kind of the goal that the EU wants to see, end goal, and wants to achieve, and so do most of the countries in the region. But the current Israeli government is quite openly rejecting this. So there's a question to what extent the coalition on the two-state solution is going to be successful right now. There's, of course, the diplomatic pressure, and there's a limit to what you can do in terms of conveying diplomatic message when it comes to condemnation of lack of the humanitarian aid access, when it comes to excessive reaction. The EU has been stressing and stressed yesterday again that while Israel has right to defend itself, the current use of force is excessive, and Israel does have obligation under the international law to allow humanitarian aid in. So I think even that is where the EU can put more focus on trying to work towards using, perhaps as suggested by the HRVP herself, EU bomb Rafah to support accessing and transferring of the humanitarian aid, which is very much needed right now to Gazan population.
Indeed, one thing that you said in both in the case of Syria and in this case, that the American role matters in all this, and in trying to put pressure and so on. And when you were talking about the relationship between Trump and Netanyahu, immediately my mind went to their meeting in the Oval Office when Trump announced that he was going to have a meeting with Iranian counterparts, so that the US and Iranian counterparts would start talking in Oman. So this is a bridge to the next topic, indeed, about the broader region and the US strategy. Maybe we start exactly from this, the Iran-US talks. We know little, but what can we, what has happened so far, and what are the steps that we can expect?
Right. Well, the Prime Minister Netanyahu was not happy when this was announced, as you may recall during that meeting. The Israeli approach toward Iran is quite different and quite openly lobbying for the military action. Now, President Trump seems to be kind of set on trying to make the deal, as he does with so many other places. He wrote a letter to the Iranians, then he approached regarding the negotiations, while of course at the same time projecting hard power in his own style, sending the US bombers and taking military action with the Houthis. What we do know is that there was a meeting this Saturday in Oman, that the talks, despite what was initially announced by the US, were not direct, they were indirect. But that the envoy Witkoff did meet with Iranians, and that the talks will continue this upcoming Saturday in Rome. And that is an important part because the Europeans were not involved in the conversation last Saturday. And of course, European member states are part of the JCPOA agreement and are very keenly interested in securing a deal and making sure that on the one hand, Iran does not enrich its uranium to the point where it can get nuclear weapon, but at the same time avoiding any confrontation and most definitely avoiding military confrontation between Israel and Iran. So with an eye on that, hopefully the placing of the next round of negotiations in Rome is a good sign for the EU.
At least a way to get some sort of access. Indeed. Now it would be nice to start I don't know if we have enough time, it would be nice to talk about what are the incentives from the Iranian side to get into the conversation with the very person who was responsible for the demise of the previous deal. But I want to talk more generally about, as part of our plan, the US foreign policy towards the region. And of course, one element you already indicated, which is consistent across theaters, Trump's desire to talk with the adversary, or with what is perceived as the adversary in at least up to 2024. That's an element. But then there's also another element of the US goals, which is the normalization between Israel and Arab countries, of course, made difficult by the current situation, and also probably a desire to withdraw from the US posture from the region even further. So the question for me is, do you see a connecting thread among these topics? Do you see a clear US strategy towards the Middle East in this current administration? Or are they trying to get away from it and focus on other theaters?
I think talking about clear strategy when it comes to the US right now in any region is difficult. What you see is discrepancies between the discourse and the actual actions to a large extent. So the discourse is that yes, President Trump wants deals. He wants, to guarantee peace, and he also wants to get the US out. And he most definitely does not want to engage militarily and bring the US boots on the ground. However, at the same time, the US is very present in the region right now. It's present in the negotiations in Gaza. It's now present in the negotiations with Iran. It's quite present in Lebanon as well. The deputy envoy for the Middle East, Morgan Ortega, was in Lebanon just recently, taking this window of opportunity with weakened Hezbollah, trying to pressure Hezbollah to disarm and make sure that the Lebanese armed forces are ensuring that there's a state monopoly for arms bearing. So in diplomatic terms, the US is quite present, but in military terms as well, then we have the bombing of the Houthis. So there is a lot of discrepancy between what is the discourse and what is the actual practice on the ground. Not all those steps are necessarily bad. I think this is a very good sign that the US is negotiating with Iran. Whether or not we're going to see some tangible results, I think this is a very good step. It's a very good step to be involved in Lebanon, and I wish Lebanon. And I think I wish there was more engagement when it comes to pushing for ceasefire in Gaza as well.
Yes, indeed. One thing that I noticed indeed when it comes to involvement is that in the famous Signalgate scandal, despite all the bad that happened, one good thing was the realization, at least for that transpired from the chat, was that the United States and President Trump cared about freedom of navigation and some of these global commons issues, and that he wanted military action to take that into account. So of course that was positive, despite all the other things that were related to this. Indicate, I think you're right, some degree of disconnect between some broad goals of this engagement and the realities of the ground that force continuous participation by the US on things. So then just one last word. I know it's, again, very complicated to distill all this, but in the broader Middle East landscape, one or two suggestions for the European leadership to act from you.
Right. Well, I will start with Syria. So definitely continue supporting the transition in Syria. Again, I think we're in, and we should be right now still in this benefit of doubt mindset when it comes to Syria. So monitoring closely what's going on and the progress that the government is or is not making with the reforms that it promised, and supporting the economic transition, focusing on very tangible results. I would start with electrification right now, trying to work with diasporas, trying to engage with other actors in the region, and trying also not to fall within the trap of thinking that it's a topic I wanted to bring up later, but it is in the commentary that you so kindly mentioned. So not falling in the trap of thinking that to balance out the Turkish power, we need to keep Russia in Syria. So having kind of a clear, maintaining the strategy we have in Syria right now would be one thing. Then not giving up on supporting the two-state solution in Gaza for sure. I think this is very welcome that we had this first EU-Palestine high-level political dialogue yesterday, and that the HRVP did visit the region. And I think we should exert more efforts to help to support in any way we can, even though, like I said, obviously we have our limits to what we can do as the EU, but try to support the transition. And then I would say on Lebanon, because we just briefly touched upon it, but also to make sure that we don't lose this window of opportunity that opened. It was very welcome that the EU moved fast to support the Lebanese armed forces, and I think this should keep on going. There's a limit, I suppose, what we can do now in terms of cooperation with the US on the ground. But given that, again, the deputy envoy Ortega was there discussing disarmament of Hezbollah, if the pressure comes from different sides, including from the EU, we can hope for more success than when it comes to just from one side. So I guess the overarching theme of my recommendation is just be present, and act strategically.
That's very important because the world is complex. There are many things that are changing. It is becoming more difficult from a strategic perspective. Europe is stretched, but it is essential to maintain the presence. Without the presence, we lose all the hands that we can play. So this, I think, we can absolutely get on board with that. Well, with that, thank you, Kasia. We are at the end, or half an hour of a quick reaction. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us, with our listeners. And for the rest of you, we'll see you again in around 2 weeks for the next episode of Europe Responds. Stay tuned.
Thank you, Giuseppe.
Bye.